My story begins very much in the same place as Tanya's story. The story I want to tell today is why ultimately it isn't going to be big business that's the future for Australia, but it is a need to reinvent our economy bottom up. But that we've got a lot of work to do if we're going to do that. Our small company ecology is not healthy, but actually we've got a huge opportunity to turn it around. Why is Australia's future not going to be built on big companies? Essentially, globalization is dramatically reshaping our economy, and we see some signs of it, and there's been much talk about it here. There is no doubt low-cost labour jobs will migrate to other parts of the world, and as the second phase of globalization takes over and smart people well-educated people into the global workforce, all sorts of middle-class jobs will migrate overseas. That's before we talk about the disruption that will be brought by any number of ranges of automation. Here in Victoria, we probably see it more than most. We've had 100,000 jobs exit the manufacturing sector. We're actually starting to see graduate employment fall quite precipitously ever since the GFC in big terms. Once it was an easy ticket, once you were educated, you were going to get a job. Those jobs are actually disappearing fast. And in recent years, we've been seeing unemployment grow. The effects of globalisation are deeply upon us, and they are not going to be solved by our big organisations. Troublingly, it's also driving significant issues in our society. We've seen a 25% increase in inequality in Australia in the period where globalisation has really taken hold, largely because one sector of our economy is plugging into the global economy and a whole other sector is increasingly excluded from it, with the service sector kind of sitting in the middle, bumping along with little real increase in their circumstances. That is pulling Australia apart socially, not just economically. It's a problem we've got to be solving. At the moment, we like and have lauded our export commodities-based sector, but we've really been living in a false reality. If we look at the long term of our commodities sector, as our terms of trade revert to the norm, it offers far less of the wealth uplift that we've expected. And when people have talked about peak oil and other realities of having ultimate scarcity, we see that technology's rapidly turned around and corrected that, and we live with a glut of oil today. And we can reasonably expect that across our economy as reinvention sees that commodities are not the future for any country. The result for Australia is not only if we look too much, we kind of have a myth with ourselves that we have an export economy because we sell a lot of stuff that goes out of this country in ships. The reality is we punch way below our weight as an export economy. You look at where we are, and here's you see the chart. Our GDP ranking versus our export ranking, we are well down the list. That's not good where wealth in a country is going to come from the level of connectivity to the global economy. We have a misshapen economy for the kind of future that is inescapably now that we are caught up with. And not only not being connected to the global economy also is a real drag on productivity. Those who are globally competitive are forced to be much more productive than those who live in lazy domestic oligopolies. And our country is full of lazy domestic oligopolies rather than rich technology companies. And perhaps Steve and I are going to have a little argument about whether technology is really the basis of Telstra's competitiveness. But I think the simple reality is in the top 20 Australian companies, I think only CSL makes a really serious case that its ultimate competitiveness is based on a globally competitive technology. You compare that to the top of the US, and it's a completely different picture. It's an economy much better suited for being integrated competitively into a global economy than ours is. So if you take out CSL, you take out the miners, in my view, we've then got a list of lazy oligopolists, lazy domestic oligopolists. And they are not the future. They are a drag on our productivity, and they are ultimately a drag on an export-based economy, and they are not going to create a great mountain of new jobs. It's delightful that ANZ's here because no doubt they're looking to become something different, and that's clearly what some of those organisations need to do. So if the big companies aren't the future, what's happening in our small company world? Well, I think it's not nearly as healthy as it needs to be. Let's take a quick little snapshot of where we're at. If we see what's been created and what's being destroyed, what rate of growth have we got versus exit, all of a sudden we're finding that the rate of exit is overtaking the rate of growth. New businesses are not growing at nearly the rate they were, and they're increasingly exiting. It's getting harder to get small companies going and growing, and that's a real challenge. And part of the difficulty for that is that what we know is that it's out of those companies that a great deal of the employment growth actually comes. comes. Companies in their first year account for more than 50% of the job growth in an economy. They really matter to have a very healthy and thriving small company ecology. It matters not just to have small companies, but important that small companies grow up, that some of them do aspire to be the next Google. And here, things aren't travelling so well either. So if we look at what's happening in our startup ecology and we compare it to what's going on in Silicon Valley, we see that startups lack in lots of ways the level of audacity that we see in the US. And ultimately, if you're going to change that list of who's really driving the economy, there's got to be serious audacity. And here you see that the scale of funding that people go out after, which is a proxy really for the scale of businesses that they're trying to build, it's nothing like what we get occurring in Silicon Valley. We have to change the sense of aspiration that this whole ecology of companies have. They have to be thinking, I'm going to be born international, I'm going to be born at least with serious scale as my ambition. And they're not surviving enough. They're not capable. There's not enough capability. It's not because people aren't putting terrific effort and there aren't real heroes in this sector, because there are fantastic people doing extraordinary things in Australia, but they're not surviving at nearly the right rate. So that's a real problem, and they're focused in too narrow a set of sectors. So if you look at this excellent little piece of work that PwC did, they looked at where is the focus. Well, we've got a lot of media and IT activity, but in fact in the sectors where we have some natural competitive advantages, we are not seeing lots of startup activity going on. So it's a lopsided set of growth. And when you think about how much Australia actually invests in science R&D, not nearly enough of that is being exploited. So there isn't a swarm in the areas where we've got the greatest capability to do something different. And that's a real problem. Our startup ecology is not nearly broad-based enough. However, I think this is possible. We can turn this around, and there are some fundamentals running strongly in our favour. The first thing is we're smart. We're seriously smart. If you compare Australia's research to, and that should read Australia rather than just the USA, if you compare Australia to the United States, we produce double the research output, double the number of citable papers per capita than the US. Australians are productive knowledge creators. It's just they turn into half the number of patents. We're good at creating the raw knowledge. We're not good at converting it. But we're really good at creating the raw knowledge. And there are lots of other things that work in our favour. We're the third easiest place in the world to start a business. It's genuinely not hard to do. We have strong human capital markets. We have lots of research, strong research rankings. We put a reasonable amount into R&D. We tell a story about ourselves that we're no good at this. We're actually 13th in the world in terms of R&D expenditure per GDP. That's not bad. It could be better, but it's not bad. However, in terms of turning inputs into outputs, our efficiency ratio in the kind of way it gets globally measured is down at 116th. We are lousy at this conversion, and that's what's really got to turn around. I always think, and partly the great value of a conference like this is inspiration. Israel offers us inspiration. It's a country smaller than us, population smaller, much more difficult setting, and it is an extraordinary innovation hub, and we've heard quite a lot about it in this conference, so I probably don't need to dwell deeply on it. But it shows that small countries in difficult circumstances can do really well. And if we look at where Australia sits relative to Israel, there's a bit of a sense of what are benchmark countries. We could also have picked Sweden, we could have picked Norway, we could have picked parts of the United States. I think it's useful to have some benchmarks to talk about, to see what these kind of places are capable of achieving, and therefore what we should be setting out to achieve. And you can see some of where we rank there, and some of where the real differences are. And one of them is also in actually what funding we provide. So there are things that we definitely need to do to turn this around. We do need to change our investor culture. I mean, if you think we have one of the deepest superannuation pools in the world, and virtually none of it ends up renewing our economy. They all invest in lazy oligopolies that make fat margins by largely exploiting consumers. That's an unfortunate place in which all our superannuation money turns up in. It's got to go somewhere else. Some of it, even some small portion of it, has to go somewhere else. We've got to change our investor culture significantly, and they need to lead the way so there's scale in that sector. That more broadly hits the question of capital availability. You'll hear arguments about in the startup community, the lack of capital. There are some real issues in that sector. I think with globally mobile capital, this can be dealt with, but we need a lot more of it domestically so that the returns are attained domestically. I'm very happy for great Australian business to get money from Silicon Valley, but it means the returns end up in Silicon Valley. They need to end up in Australia. We've got to change the way capital availability works. Our regulatory system is not terrific. There are too many barriers to small companies growing, and too many barriers in the tax system to small companies being able to make returns from their growth on the basis of capital. That discourages people actually from having employee share schemes and other things that mean you can pay less and grow much more rapidly. So there are things that government can do. This current government has been cutting back on the assistance for export growth, for companies that want to engage in export growth. That's absurd. One of the big things is we've got to drive global scale. That does require support in an economy like ours because we haven't got all of the networks that we need in order to do that. People need support to do that. I do think our lazy big businesses have a role to play because they can buy out of this sector. You'll find in other economies people much more readily buy out of their own startup sector. And in some parts of Australia, this is mission critical. I have a deep kind of engagement and love for Tasmania. It is a disgrace how little big business or government buys from Tasmanian startups. And you can multiply that across some of the most disadvantaged parts of Australia. It would transform our society, not just our economy, if we were prepared to buy from our own startups, help them get scale so they can go global. We've got to also create a new level of capability, and that's where education is an important part of the story. And I think it's a story from start to finish in the education system. We've heard lots of criticism of our school system, all well placed. The other thing I think I'd want to add to it is we are not developing a culture for children who are going to have to create their own work and their own jobs. Our schools culture does not drive entrepreneurism. We are not a lemonade stall culture. We need to be. We don't teach children to code. Every child in Australia should be able to code because whatever they do will be technology-based. The level of STEM education in Australia is nowhere near it to be, and it's been flatlined and slightly declining for a decade. That is not okay. They are changeable. Those are fixable things. We don't engage in nearly enough project-based education in schools, and we certainly don't make starting your own little enterprise something that people can do. And I think that's rapidly can be changed significantly. The good news is entrepreneurship at all levels can be taught. People say, actually, can you really teach this? We can if we do a few things. One, we recognise there's some technical skills to develop, and actually, and it was my little hotspot before, we've learned a lot of things about how you can teach the entrepreneurial imagination. And finally, we have to be careful we don't have a stereotype of entrepreneurs. The most successful ones often appear as kind of larger-than-life characters. The reality is the entrepreneurial world is made up of a very diverse set of people, from the quiet scientists right through to the most noisy advocates of their own things. The full spectrum, and we can give them the skills that they need. And I think more importantly, we've got generational change on our side. We've been engaged in some market research around what the coming through generation of people in their 20s are looking for. Sitting on about a third of them want to start their own business or run their own organisation in their lives. It's become a generational aspiration. They've got suspicious of big government. They've got suspicious of big business. They want to do their own things. We need to give them the skills and capability to do it. There are hardly any courses in entrepreneurship in Australia. It's not a mainstream part of the curricula. Every university student should be leaving university with the sense that they can at least have had a very real opportunity to get some of the skills to set about doing it. So if I say all of that, then I think I'm on the hook for something, and we are. So we're kind of serious about this as a task. Peter Wade, himself an entrepreneur, gave us $10 million last year to work with the University of Melbourne to break some new ground here, to build some new capability. So we're looking for a first cohort. We're after 60 people to lead the way in this change. We want people who are audacious, we want purpose-driven people, and we want people who are going to be real co-creators. All for reasons that we think these will be contributors to it. So we're going to be on the search around the country over the next year to get that 60 people who can start leading the change and help us develop a completely new way in which we might start to educate that new generation of people who will make the kind of difference our economy needs. There are countless kind of roles for entrepreneurs in Australia, countless ways of educating them. We want 60 people actually who have the audacity to say we can change, we can break into that top 20 within our well and truly within our lifetimes, and create businesses that will repopulate the Australian economy. We believe that's doable, it's teachable, and there's a generation that does it. We want to find them.
Wow. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent.